Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday Melt Battle Lounge with the 2MK team, or rather, some subset of the 2MK team. This is our EU lounge. Usually it's smaller. As you can see on screen already, there are 2 slots open if you do want to join in. Today we'll be concentrating on offense from my side and possibly defense from Sun's side, as usual. But it could just be blazing offense trading off the whole time. So, anything I mention on stream analysis wise will probably be focused on thinking about offense because we did specifically cover a bunch of other things last time. The specifics of how you achieve the offense you want in this game, as I mentioned before, heavily influenced by accuracy. But of course, spacing does come in as well. And in this case, the way that spacing comes in the most, in this particular matchup, has to do with reaching with a certain max range move. In fact, max range attacks are a large part of offense in this game, simply because they're the hardest to punish. Normally in other games, hitting with your max range attack doesn't allow you to do anything further, and therefore you don't really care about whether or not you're doing it unless it's a footsies option. But in this game, because you can almost always convert correctly if you are familiar with what your next conversion should be, your best bet is to aim for the max you can reach from. And you can also use this to mislead your opponent about whether or not you're actually going to do it, because so many moves recover relatively quickly compared to other games. Since the game is so heavily based on movement and the exact space between 2 players isn't as obvious, a lot of the time people will have more trouble than in a game like Street Fighter, for example, judging whether or not your attack was intended to hit them or just keep space open for you. And this can be advantageous in lots of ways because you can spend a lot of time hitting buttons that will catch an opponent who is advancing, but not manage to get you killed easily if they weren't. Your opponent's job in that case is usually to get out of the way and to use whatever move they think is the best option for getting out of the way. Which is why you see so much of the aerial game becoming so important. If your opponent attacks on the ground at max range a lot, your best bet is to get off the ground. Max range also protects you from the shorter ranges of certain opponent attacks. For example, whether or not I actually can land that charged 5C against that move is almost entirely a spacing thing. Similarly, whether or not a counter-attack will work off that flame armor is also related to similar things. Even that is partially a range thing. The interaction happens because the hitboxes in this game have to be compared for clash purposes. And if they're compared for the clashes, then you're going to get much more depth in terms of what the game is checking for, both in terms of whether or not a certain move hits first, and technically, obviously, whether or not it hits at all. But because so many moves have multiple hits, it has to calculate after every close range frame, especially if they do clash, will they clash again? And if it will not, then someone has to be basically declared the winner of that interaction. In many cases in that round, my opponent's spacing prevented me from doing anything much, and if I try to break through it, then they've already set up their own match range strikes, so I don't really get anything out of it. As is possible to prevent both dealing with my throw and having to deal with anything else, because again the spacing is just correct all the way. Similarly, I now have to measure the range at which this is a good idea from further away. Because of the way that max range moon moves work as well, you're going to be spending more time trying to figure out whether or not it's worth your time to do it, because they tend to not combo at max range, but they're much safer to do as a whole. In fact, to spend as much time measuring range as you do in this game can often help you learn to play other games a little better, because you're playing a game where that is basically almost everything you're doing. Once you've gotten past the accuracy difficulty and figured out how your character's moves are supposed to work, how far they reach, and strikes of that type, almost everything you do is just spent measuring distance. Combos are very fluid, and most of the time once you've learned how to confirm, you don't actually have to worry that much about taking damage anyway. This isn't one of those games where if you do your combo wrong, you're going to get punished for messing up the ending. as often, especially if you've gotten to the launcher section. If you drop the execution, it's even more likely that you're safe. The game is basically designed not necessarily to be easy in that regard, but definitely helps out. So with all the time spent measuring your distances, it's no wonder that if you get them right, you will more or less find yourself at very heavy advantage. There's also therefore a benefit to setting up movements in situations that your opponent will have more trouble figuring out the range, and you will have less. This can be even further thrown off from their side by understanding their character's backdash range. Since staying in the spot that you put them in long enough to be put into whatever next mix-up blender or long-range attack you choose is a bad idea, most people will either have to backdash or back jump, since they can't tell if you're setting them up to make them use some move to get out of the situation, and then baiting that move. It's almost always safer in this game to backdash out of it. Even though backdash chasing, especially at max range, can be difficult, and you probably shouldn't spend too much time aiming to do that, understanding where your opponent will be after the backdash allows you to just continue with the same concept, knowing what is probably happening, what they are most likely to do or most able to do, and therefore be able to decide whether or not you should even do that in the first place. Specifically, do the chase. Characters who appear to have shorter ranges can be stronger at this in specific ways because their moves tend to take slightly less time for the general reason of not wanting to telegraph too much. You can think of it mostly as pushing people around and trying to make sure that you are not pushed around yourself. When facing a character who has similar good max range moves to you, then you'll have to do a lot more guessing. And if facing an opponent who definitely doesn't, what you normally need to watch out for is their defensive moves, their charge moves, their armored moves, because if they do not intend to dash away, that's usually their best bet, to go for something else that will power through whatever it is you've chosen to do. Depending on the character, these pressure strings might not actually work all of the time. But it does cause a lot of players to think more about the options they have when you're close. It's actually a very common thing in fighting games to frustrate the opponent by being able to attack in a way that you can't actually hit, which makes them more likely to do things once they've gotten into that space where you could. And depending on what it is, you might get something out of it. Perfectly grabbed at max range once again. No matter what I had hit there, as long as I was going to attempt to continue my attack, that grab was going to work. This game tends to have lower invincibility options than many others, resulting in that sort of thing being more assured. So you're being even more rewarded for perfect spacing. You can even use it defensively to force opponent combos to drop, for example. And similarly, by standing just outside of throw range, my opponent is able to make sure that I am going to hit something. If I want to get to them, I either have to short dash into micro walk or something and leave myself open to a long strike, or give up on the throw because it will whiff just in front of them and therefore will probably choose to use a longer attack. Going into the air takes some time and they can respond to that far more easily. So the only options I really have are very fast attacks crossing areas, but even then, given that that can be shielded, since nearly none of them will be lows, as just literally I'm hitting this button, that's all I have to do in the time it takes for you to reach me. Sometimes a throw will solve this, and sometimes just shield will solve it. You see Koma being able to use the charged C for the same reason. Similarly there, with the type of armor available, the only way for me to strike at my opponent at that range is to try to hit them with the max range of a different move, and they therefore just armor through it. One can just use a different move, but the risk is increasing most of the time. That, for example, is much more punishable than the A version. Instant air dashes are one of the main ways people get around this problem. But overall, whether or not you can instant air dash into the proper situation is also related to what range you're at. Meaning that if you spend your time trying to measure ranges, and your character happens to have an instant air dash attack range that doesn't help the situation, it's very similar to one of your other attack ranges, then you're still not able to do anything. The time that you spend getting into the air, even for the instant air dash, your opponent's entire plan was to stop you. And depending on what your options in the air are, and their armor or clash timings, you won't get anything at all. This is seen most powerfully on characters like Archwade who have the long, basically moves like that. While they're not as good for defending against the pressure situation, they'll get you out of a lot more close range ones, like this one. But your opponent, again, can just be on guard for those things, and you have to come up with something else altogether. This character's main options for those things are kind of weird and not what most people would expect, because it was apparently something that was, I don't know if it was changed or if it was just misinterpreted, the data I had. That move, however, helps a lot in these scenarios because it does go further. And having to think about it does matter. So we've now moved to this phase of this matchup where my opponent has forced me to use Moon Meter, especially on that. But I'm not using it because I think this move is going to hit them. I just need to have an option that makes them do something other than what they were doing. Just making sure that they were correctly positioned to stop me. If you stand at the right places versus Archway, she really doesn't have a lot of options that you can't see coming. And since so many of them are just stand shieldable, you don't even have to crouch and put yourself in any further danger. They're also relatively long commits, or relatively easily punished. So once you've started to get that spacing down, the player must not only go for more complex things, they have to spend a lot of time with the absolute intention that their moves aren't going to hit at all. Koma in particular has options here because even if the sweep is hit, if the chosen option was armor, nothing will happen. But she does have one option that's very unclear to many people, because it's not a good starter at max range. You can just hit Heavy Punch. The way to actually combo off that move can be trickier than most. And if you spend time at those spaces properly, similar to in DOA, how you will not end up being able to do much if you just try to get right in front of your opponent at the end of your pressure string and a knockdown. You're generally more so caring about making sure that you don't give them advantage positionally. Another benefit to it is, of course, that you can spend more time getting through the opponent's plan. In this case, if you have a long-range move that can be charged, you will often find that because you charged it, your opponent's shield will make sure they can always just hit you. They will not fail the shield. But this is more effective. And once you've done the full shield version, you might not be able to do that properly. But again, just hitting heavy hitting 5C isn't that great an idea. You could mash too much, you could have all sorts of other problems. And despite her chargeable B being really helpful, that was even worse for the prospect. So we've gone up one level of this matchup already. But it did take half a stream, so that's probably about right. One of the difficult things of learning to play this game is that while the amount of depth in it once you're at max level is relatively more flat, the mid levels are very, very volatile because you have no way of being sure what your opponent does and does not understand about any given matchup. This happens in a lot of games actually, but it's much more pronounced in Melty because so many more of the things you're dealing with are process checks, execution checks. You can't easily trick most opponents. It's either pressure or you dance around until one of you misses. So now we are at actually the point of whiff punishes from 5C happening in neutral and things of that nature. In fact, you could think of it as the entire match having changed from our perspective, because the thing that we're trying to do has more or less completely transformed. See, even this week we'll face the same sorts of input problems. I don't remember what I was actually hitting there. You can be more creative with characters who have 2 air backdashes, or rather 2 air movements, and of course, if you find yourself locked into the same situation over and over again because you can't jump out and then resume your attack, a large part of the way to solve that is to actually just go into Moondrive and have more jumps. But it's still a matter of figuring out exactly which aspect of your style is important to keep going. For example, here, I benefit from having it because I can do more baiting to lead into possible uses of the meter. No, this is too early. No, I got it this time. Your opponent has to, like, recover at a very, very specific timing to avoid that. But I think there's a downside to doing so. Therefore, it is possible to sometimes land that. You do have to be watching to see how far they fall, and I think I flinched and just did it because I thought it was going to work, more so than because I saw it was going to work. Alright, new stage. This I don't remember it looking like this, but then again I didn't watch all that hard last time. This game is so weird with that. I was able to cancel, I believe I can cancel Light Claw Uppercut into EX Claw Uppercut on frame 1 or something. So if I see something happening like a charge up that makes me think, oh, I'm not going to hit with this light, I need to then do something else, I just can. Ah, dropped it. Armored perfectly. There are a couple more moves to flesh out this matchup in total, based on the matches I had with that S-rank Koma a while back. But that's what I meant about the paths. Sun has used a different path style toward their mastery of this character, compared to what I saw. The one I saw was a lot of managing to perfectly land charge 2C, and not really caring about much else. Their defense against air stuff was really good, but spacing was a little bit harder to perfect for them, I think. So while I would get whiff punished, the specifics of the outcomes of those whiff punishes generally didn't involve as much danger to me. The intensity and speed of this means that for some fights, you're just watching a bunch of things happen so fast in your mind that even doing longer combos just so it gives you a break to think about something other than the number of options that could just have happened can be super important. And then of course, the combo part is easier if you're used to these games, but scraping every little bit of damage you can out of an endgame situation becomes even more important. This comes up more often because if you are starting your combos from pressure, getting used to your basic situation, and moving from there, you'll spend a lot more time trying to figure out how to maximize the damage you have with the meter you have, instead of spending more time trying to figure out how to maximize every damage bit you can get from any point of contact. But we now have Empress Olivia, the same matchup basically, which is probably good for dealing with the same things, because we don't necessarily get that much time to practice this game, so there are definitely points where Sun can have, we all have problems just having to learn whatever the opponent's newest complex idea is. And that'll probably be a good explanation I meant about the paths. This player has a very similar way of playing than when I started, because you can really just safely walk around with Arcuate as if you don't care at all. Because her moves are fast, and because she has the ability to attack literally any point on the screen at her preference, it's very hard for an opponent to decide it's time to challenge you just because you're walking forward at me. But you see, again, Sun using up the same sorts of spacings, which results in the opponent being able to spend a lot less time in attack mode. But even getting used to that, for example, that move is quite punishable. But the thing you'd expect to happen isn't always the thing that happens. Again, because of ranges. It's easier to defend against basic pressure in this game than it is to do a lot of other things. So, for example, right, there's actually a gap there. And that's why I don't do it, partially. Because it's mostly an execution test to the opponent whether or not they can hit the gap, but I know that eventually I'm just going to face people who will straight up hit the gap, and I have to have other things by the time I have that. So being aware that I can do that to help me get out of pressure is great, and more importantly, understanding that there is a gap in this and therefore it's not completely real takes even more effort. Because I have to keep that option in the back of my mind while building up a bunch of other concepts for what to do instead, so that eventually one day that move will be helpful. Bots obviously help you to not flinch in these sorts of situations, but depending on the game and the style of play that your opponents have, you can learn some of this with just playing against your partners and teammates and so on for long enough. I don't consider that worth it either, for example, as it just takes too long. Even though you can definitely stop doing that basically anytime. There's the spacing, but the jump back does get caught. And note that Empress Olivia actually did the B cat uppercut, because that's the one that's going to reach. It's I'm reading your chase, I'm not just doing the A one because the A one might help. Similarly, she's a particularly good character at keeping high damage because of specific things. Looks like it's getting a little laggy, but I'm not really sure how bad it actually is. Because that might be how it looks to me, because they're both EU, for all I know. Perfectly spaced. But definitely, I can't be sure. I'll have to ask. But one person's willing to rematch, and they're the one that lost from whatever it was that happened, so we'll see. Yep, here we go. I have asked, I have been told it is laggy, yes. The rollback in this game makes the lag not so bad for certain matchups, but honestly this is a matchup where the lag is pretty bad, because there are a lot of spaces, tiny spaces that you have to hit to stop the opponent from doing specific things. To play this, let's call it fairly, brings it back down to exactly neutral again, and to exactly being at the right spacing so that you don't have to worry about the fact that it's laggy. It can cause you to drop your combos, but I think one of the things that causes the biggest problems for me in lag is knowing whether or not you can follow up the bounce off the fatal counter for your shield, and just generally shield combos. They're harder by far. Similarly, the speed at which one has to think about what is happening means that those moments where it stutters is basically advantage to whoever was on the attack at that moment. It's really rough for other reasons as well, but partially because there's just no way to know what to do. There are too many options by most standards. Of course, that does mean that you can just sometimes go straight at it and solve your problem the other way. These two characters as a pair are particularly good at showing off the thing I'm talking about, because they have setups, but the way their setups work are spacing related in the first place. So you spend a lot of time, you can watch this matchup for a very long time and spend a lot of time understanding just how much very, very tiny changes in spacing are affecting the matchup. Even there, the max range of that move can make it a little bit easier to make sure that your opponent doesn't just punish you for doing it. Got to just enough meter. But unfortunately, that was, I think, a bait, and therefore expecting to hit the opponent who would be trying to check the dash. But as it is, in fact, apparently laggy, it's probably not the best situation. Let's see, I don't have a terribly good connection to them either, which is odd because technically it means I have no good connection to either. I wonder where they are. I'm good at this mirror match against one style of Arcade and terrible at it against the other style. But I don't think I could explain easily which is which. I would say that this is likely to be somewhat even from what I've seen so far, but if you notice my opponent playing very differently than they played in the Koma matchup, that's probably the reason. That they've switched to the form of the matchup that I'm worse at. Because you are supposed to play this matchup a specific way, it's just that you can't both play it that way. So it's very hard to decide. It's basically both players constantly wanting to not be the one that has to play the harder way for very long. But this isn't so bad because this is much closer to what I expect from both people trying to play the same style because they prefer it. Arcade is weak to Arcade's lows, in short. It makes the red Arcade matchup even harder, because she has not the same lows, but similar enough that you could probably not, like, die. So now I absolutely can't tell you which of us is going to come out on top in this sort of match. I would think it will mostly come down to the usual thing it does. Who uses their moon meter better? You'll notice that in many matches I have no real reason to use my moon meter. This matchup is probably the deciding factor. Who decides what to do with their moon meter is a big deal. Can't use that there, I forgot. For example, this is a better idea because I know that my opponents will automatically prefer lows because it's the matchup. Therefore, doing something to get me over the low on my wake up is better than trying to just get out or uppercut or something, because they want to get out of that space. Similarly, that was technically a bad choice, because I keep on forgetting, like, that move is hard on me because the moon version of that move and the regular version of that move are relatively different in what they're for. Because that's the regular version. It's a long charge, it's a big hit. You spend a lot more time thinking about what your opponent wants to do in response to it, and so on. Did I hit the gap? I'm not really worried about this, for example, for the same reason I mentioned before. It's bad, yes, but the amount of damage taken isn't, like, overwhelming. Too slow. But now we both have full moon, so they went for pressure. Good choice. It might not be too visible, but there are a bunch of mix-ups and match-up things happening already that I don't know if they're thinking about them, but based on the fact that they're not just repeating the same strings and situations, I'll assume that they're not. That, for example, was slightly off in the spacing, and it is also technically an execution test. That combo dropped. I should have probably gone for the finish with that. I'm not sure I would have managed it though. She's weak to lows partially because most of her good moves, other than the lows themselves, require her to stand. So things you want to do in neutral to make sure that your opponent can't just do whatever they want to you involve making sure that you do not, in fact, crouch. Covered. Covered again. This time, got it. This time I'm gonna go for it. Yep. I got all like into it and now I don't even know. No, match is actually over after. Okay. So it looks like we get one more look at the same thing once again, and I get to talk about it a little more before the stream ends. We're not necessarily going over for the extra 5 minutes it took me to start. But it depends on how the match goes, really. So with a couple hours of practice, Sun mostly has all the spacings required. And we know that the opponent has a lot of the same concepts of how to resolve problems at those spacings. And I don't know if they necessarily have as much familiarity with the matchup as a whole. But fortunately, as noted, you don't have to understand this matchup a lot. It takes a while before you absolutely need to go to next level of it. Unfortunately, the lag is probably just going to make that difficult or impossible anyway, so... I meant from the Arcwid side, actually. While there are definitely things where Sun will have, basically, this is an execution test I can't pass because lag. The spacings will generally prevent those from happening. And even though there will definitely be more ways that this opponent chooses to deal with situations, they're not that different. So basically, using the overall understanding of advantage, if Sun just uses the same defenses as against me, the results will probably be maybe 10-20% more damage, which is a big deal, yes, but not enough to necessarily require a change if one is already familiar with the other parts of the matchup. If anything, it's just spending more time like this, like healing back up. Because the game does offer you that option. If the situation doesn't suit you, but you're able to continue winning in neutral, then figuring out how to get meter and then heal yourself will sometimes heal you 10-25% health, meaning that you've already balanced it out. I'm really happy about their decision to put the healing to that strength and that level of importance in the game, because it does allow for more tactics and allow for more scenarios in which things weren't going your way, but you understood, you figured out why that was, and were able to use the meter you probably built up to get a second chance at trying to turn around the match because you realize you've got it. This is compounded by the ability to use the 2AB to charge, and more importantly, to use your moon meter to get extra regular gauge in various forms. So I definitely would not suggest playing this game very seriously in this level of lag, but a relatively friendly match in a matchup you actually know, this is probably bearable, because it mostly sticks rather than like confusing you. The designer of this game, well rather the netcode for this game, like, I'm not sure if they were a proud person to begin with, but if they were, they definitely swallowed their pride. They got on Twitter, they basically told a lot of people and asked a lot of questions. How do I fix this part of the netcode because I don't see how this is supposed to work? Or when I do it, it doesn't work the way as well as I expected, so how can I do this better? Those were important aspects of it, to the point where they just were literally asking on Twitter, how do I fix this? And mostly it shows, because these connections we have are quite far. You can't necessarily tell, but yeah, we are not close to these. We're not close together enough that this is great. And I really have no idea where this player is. They could be in Borneo. What's the fighting game scene like in Borneo? There's that spacing again. Once again, a situation where the bait didn't quite work, but had enough health regeneration left due to where it got hit to get back quite a lot. And leaving the opponent with no meter means that you don't necessarily have to worry about any explosive damage coming to you, and therefore can go a little more rough, allowing Sun to turn that one around. Looks like we are kind of going over to our at least 3 or so of the minutes of our extra 5. 5, 6? I really am not sure, I'll chat later. But this is probably very close to the end. We'll probably have another similar lounge later, barring any serious issues happening. The NA version of this lounge this evening at 7:30 Eastern Time. Is it gonna work? It is! We're still working on making our Melty Blood bots easy enough to understand and use. But for now, looks like they're out as well. And we might be done. So we're continuing our match. The lounge is probably not staying open. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org under their various headings. I'm not sure the Melty one is up, but I'll check. And all of our information about when we'll be streaming at 2_mk_FGC. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.